you again for calling in and logging in to the last in our New Mexico Main Street webinar series for spring 2017. Today's webinar, The Competent Board, Tools for Measuring Effectiveness, will be presented today by Eduardo Martinez. And this is the third in a series that we've been presenting this spring tied to board development. My name is Anna Bly, and I'm the Communications and Media Specialist here with New Mexico Main Street. And just again, welcome everyone, and also want to introduce Eduardo.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'll go ahead and get started with a presentation, a little bit of background information. Just want to let you know, these three webinars were intended to be short introductory pieces, about 20-minute presentations. Right now we have everybody in audio-only mode so that you can listen. You'll see a control panel on your screen that has some controls. The number you see there now is not the dial-in number, but it should be in your control panel. As we move through the presentation, you can listen either through the computer or by calling into the conference number. I will say that in the past we've had a little bit of challenges with bandwidth on the receiving end of the presentations, and so if you're having problems hearing us, then it might be best to use the conference number to call in. At the end of the session, we'll take anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes, depending on how many questions we have, to answer any questions. And so as something comes up, just feel free to type in your question in the question box on the control panel, hit the send button, and then we'll review those at the end of the session as well. As Ana said, I'm Eduardo Martinez. I'm the New Mexico Main Street Revitalization Specialist in Organization and Leadership Development. Talk a little bit about today's webinar. What we're going to cover today is a little bit at the front end, some elements of a competent nonprofit board. I will say that this webinar is a little bit more tailored to a Main Street ACD or Frontier Community Initiative than the first one. This is the third in our series of webinars, as Anna mentioned earlier. And so the first one was very more generic for nonprofit boards specifically. Today's session will spend a little bit more time about measuring your effectiveness as a Main Street or an arts and cultural district organization. So the second half, actually most of the presentation, will look at some tools that we have. We do have 4 handouts that you can download. 3 of these are tools that I'll cover in the presentation. The 4th is a slide presentation. So if you look at your control panel, on the right side of your screen, there's a little section that says handouts, and you can just download the files from there. So a little bit, for those of you who sat in on the first webinar, I talked a little bit about the proficient board and board recruitment and board onboarding of board members, et cetera, right? But just want to distinguish that presentation from today. So, talked about back then about a proficient board being knowledgeable of their roles, engaged in the work, ready to commit their time and money, willing to be an ambassador, and attentive to what's happening with the organization now and looking towards the future. Today, I want to introduce the difference between a proficient board and competent board, right? So not only is a competent board not only willing to be an ambassador, but also understands the responsibilities of an ambassadorship and how to engage that work, builds a strong partnership with the executive director and the other staff, brings some energy. So if you look at the left side of the screen, I use the acronym USEFUL. It's with an A instead of a U. So the acronym cover the 6 points I'm covering here, right? So energetic, focused on oversight. A competent board focuses on oversight, including ethical practices, legal compliance issues, etc. Really builds accountability and is accountable to the organization, and adopts an attitude of listening and learning. And so the rest of the conversation today, I will really cover the adage at the bottom of the screen that says, what gets measured gets done, right? And so an organization, a competent board that really looks at how they're measuring their work will really see how they're moving forward through their process as well. In my nonprofit management training, I introduced the concept of the stages of development of a nonprofit organization. from concept to closure. We want every organization to stay at the established phase, and the items in the box that you see here are all those things that feed your growth or detract from your growth as a nonprofit organization. Your financial resources, your opportunities, your management leadership, your programs, your administrative systems, and your board of directors. At each stage, there are characteristics of the board and the executive director that you want to look for, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on these two slides here today, but I just want to let you know that for each developmental stage of the organization, you'll find a board and staff have different characteristics. And the same with the financial goals of the organization in each stage, right? You'll have different goals and different financial needs at your deployment phase when you're just opening up an organization versus an established stage. So let's start out the conversation a little bit about the tools in measuring your effectiveness around your board and executive partnership. So this is the relationship between the board and the executive director. First of all, I have a tool here, and I'll be happy to send this one to you on request. This one is not in the handouts list, but it basically identifies what areas of responsibility for a nonprofit the board would have versus the staff, and then maybe where you have joint responsibilities in moving your work forward. So good, effective board executive partnership starts out by clearly delineating the roles and responsibilities for both the board and the staff. I'm going to show you a sample here of a job description for a nonprofit executive director. So good evaluation of your executive director starts with the job description, right? So this sample shows 7 elements of the job, from resource development to policy advocacy work. This example is for New Mexico Main Street's partner, the New Mexico Resiliency Alliance. So start with the job description. What were the elements of why you hired your director? Move into a scope of services or a program plan for that director. So you'll see in the slides here, we took that job description and start to develop performance goals and benchmarks at the beginning of the fiscal year for that role. Right? So taking the job description, moving into the scope of work and performance goals, and then finally going through an evaluation process. Hopefully your executive directors are able to put together a monthly or at least a quarterly executive director report or written report that is presented to the board, and in some cases your partners. And we know some communities, they're sharing this information with their city council or their city manager. If you see this monthly or you see this quarterly, it's a good opportunity for the board to just take a moment and look at what's happening, what are the course corrections, what are the minor adjustments that the executive needs to make in their day-to-day performance, right? So hopefully you have this information written down so that the board see in advance of a board meeting and just have a short conversation at a monthly session. Quarterly as well, you want to think about taking a look at, and I'll spend a little bit more time with this later, your economic transformation strategies. Those of you that are Main Street communities, arts and cultural districts have not put together these ETS mapping pieces, but you can use your annual work plans, right? So what are your 4-point activities? What are your outcomes? Boards should take a look at this about once every quarter and just do a check on how we're doing on our projects, right? So this also gives an opportunity for you to check in with your executive director on how are they helping the organization move forward with your projects as well. I do have, and this is one of the handouts that you'll find in the handout section, generic annual assessment form for a Main Street director, and this covers about 7 different areas, and I suggest you do use one of these tools at least once a year, the start of the fiscal year or the end of the fiscal year, and just do a review of your organization. This is about a 3-page document, and each section has room for comments at the bottom. So you can hand this out to the other board members, Everybody can fill it out, put some comments together, and then the executive committee or the board chair can review this with your director. We also have in the handout a performance plan sample and a performance plan process. So this is a Word document that you'll find in the handouts, and it basically allows you to use it as a template around what are the activities we want this director to focus on this year, and then use the same tool to evaluate the director, right? This again is a once a year event. You can use the other tool if you prefer that one. It's easier. You can use this tool, but I think you want to make sure that you start out with setting out the performance goals for the year and then evaluating that process, both along the way and at the end of the year. You want to think about, how are projects moving forward? What is the director or other staff engagement with the board, with community members, with partners? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What areas need improvement as well? So you'll see this sample in the handout section as well. Going to move to volunteers a little bit. There are 3 areas. We have some tools. These are not uploaded to the handout section, but we have some tools if you want to look at your committee or task force volunteers, your event volunteers. But if you evaluate volunteers, there are basically three areas, right? Professionalism, reliability, responsibility, and effectiveness that you want to cover. And so you want to think about, from the professional standpoint, does the volunteer understand why they're there? Do they know your mission, their goals? Are they comfortable keeping confidentiality where it's needed? And do they relate well with the public? From the responsibility, are they timely? Do they take on and do they complete the assignments as a volunteer? And perhaps they're just placed in a role that they're not comfortable with and not as effective, and so you might want to think about a different role there. Right? And then around the effectiveness, I think the most important here is to look at your number 7 and 8, your volunteers, from the perspective, are they communicating well? Are they engaging well? And are they building partnerships, not only with you as an organization, but with others that are helping you get your work done? I'm going to move to the board. The board, I strongly believe that the board should go through a self-assessment, ask themselves the question once a year, how are we doing? Conduct a self-evaluation of your directors, your processes, your succession work, and your board development work. How are you managing finances, the director? How are you dealing with compliance? Are you moving forward with your planning and strategy development as needed, right? I have a tool. There's another tool that's on the handout section that covers most of this for stronger evaluation. I think not just a self-assessment, but you might want to ask your staff, your executive director, your partners, your city partners, local government, and constituents for some feedback, maybe every couple of years, right? How are we doing? And so you'll see this is the tool that's on there. There's also about 7 or 8 sections to this tool that basically allows the board to say, how are we doing? I strongly recommend that the board do this at least once a year. It gives you an opportunity to just do a check-in and say, these meetings are working well for everybody, or we need to make some adjustments, etc. Right? So that's a handout that's available to you on the download section as well. There are a couple of other areas that you want to think about when you're out evaluating your organization. So we're moving from the staff, the executive director, to your volunteers, to your board, and now to the organization, right? So think about your progress with projects. Those are short-term evaluations. Your outputs, also short-term. Your outcomes and your systems and processes are more sort of long-term. What do we need to adjust and refocus on as we move forward, right? So evaluating the organization, let's go back to if you're a MainStreet community, you've identified economic transformation strategies, you've identified your project, you've identified outcomes, which is the column on the right. So you want to do a quick check-in on these over, say, quarterly on your projects. Your outcomes evaluation is going to be a long-term piece, right? So you want to make sure, if you look at those examples on the right, increased business, foot traffic, and attendance at events as an outcome. Additional funds generated for operating expenses and programs. You want to think about how are you measuring that? If that's your outcome, how do you know that you're moving the needle around this strategy? So spend some time thinking about that. We're happy to help, and we're actually going through everybody's economic transformation strategies right now to look at sort of metrics that we might be able to share with you that might translate across multiple communities as well. Just a quick overview of the outputs versus outcome. Many of you have seen this slide before in some of our economic transformation strategy trainings. The difference between your outputs measure what you do. Those are your activities and who you engaged. Your outcomes are really measuring what changed and what was the impact, right? So keep in mind that there are 3 different levels of outcomes. You're changing short-term knowledge and awareness and attitudes. That leads to a change in actions and behaviors in the community. And then in the long run, you're changing the conditions, economic conditions of your Main Street district, your civic engagement conditions. And so you want to think about, as you move through your long-term evaluation, how are you measuring that change and that impact of your work? Okay? Couple of pieces I want to cover here. Keith does a great job. Your directors do a great job of pulling together information for the quarterly reports that are sent into New Mexico Main Street and shared with both the National Main Street Center and the state legislature. So this is a quarterly investment piece. And so this is part of your evaluation process as well. I'm a little surprised that sometimes we go into a community during an annual site visit, we carry this document and share it with the board, and we'll get some feedback and questions from the board. Oh, we're missing some data here, or we're not sure where this is coming from, right? So take a moment. Your directors submit those reports quarterly, but it's a good opportunity after they're submitted, or even before if you have time, to take a look at what's being submitted to the state by way of the economic reporting tools. Right? Then Keith does a great job of compiling that data. So this is an email a screenshot of an email that Keith sent out at the beginning of this year, basically showing great performance of 2016 and talked about some of the benchmarks there. So kudos to Keith for thanking everybody for their work and their diligence in submitting the evaluation. But I think it's important for the board as well to make sure they're taking a look at the numbers in their communities as well. Robin also has some tools around evaluating events. So this goes both the economic impact and your promotions. There's 2 important pieces around how you evaluate your work. I won't spend a whole lot of time around this, but there are a number of different tools that you can use to measure your effectiveness in events. I will defer that feedback to Robin on what might work best for your event or your community, but I just want to introduce this as one of the other pieces that the board and the organization can think about when they're going through asking themselves, how are we doing? And how are we doing specifically with events as well? The other piece, most of you already know the National Main Street Center's 10 standards of performance, right? And these are the elements that are covered in the New Mexico Main Street's annual site visit and review of your program. And so last year we moved from just a basic survey on SurveyMonkey to a little bit more comprehensive feedback tool that asked everybody not only here's the standard, here's the guidelines to check off where they were, but also to provide some narrative feedback in each section around what they were doing, how they were accomplishing that work. We found this tool to be a little bit, actually much more effective in the assessment process. Definitely requires a little bit more time on the front end by your staff and your boards, but this is the important evaluation tool that New Mexico Main Street uses when they're doing your site visits. When we're on site, there's a couple of things we do ahead of time. The annual budget and salary survey is a tool. We bring that feedback back to you during that site visit. We share your responses to the standards, and we have an opportunity to talk about what area do you need help with. We do spend some time during the annual site visit talking about your partnerships, particularly with local government and your business and property owners, how you're moving through your 4 points projects, any challenges that you're having with board operations, and then moving through your outcomes, right? So these are the points of conversation we use during the annual site visit. I do want to also introduce here today a service that's available to you. This is probably takes several weeks to go through for those organizations who are a bit more mature or in a rebuilding process and want to really understand where they are. So there's 5 sections that I will spend time with the organization with, reviewing all your documents, all your reporting pieces, all your systems and processes, right? Your programs, your projects, your staffing issues, your reporting pieces, your operational processes, including your policies and procedures. I'll be happy to review those, right? Your fiscal processes, and then any planning activities, assessment, or other structural information. Here's where I have an opportunity to look at your communications and say, you know, this is where your gaps are in communications, or here's where your gaps are in resource development, right? Again, this process takes a couple of weeks. I do most of this remotely, but then I would come back in and do a presentation to the board around, here is the comprehensive organizational assessment that's different from the MainStreet annual site visit. Here are your gaps and here are your strengths, right? So if you're interested in a comprehensive review, please let me know, submit a service request, and I'll be happy to start that process. Again, I think this process works best for an organization that has been around at least 5 years, and it ties these products and the review of this back to where you should be on your stages of development as well. Finally, I just want to say, once you hear great examples from Los Alamos Arts and Cultural District, Los Alamos Main Street event that Suzette and Rose put together, tell the story of how you're doing. Capturing the data, monitoring how you're doing, really only gives a limited number of people feedback on how you're doing, right? So think about how you're preparing the information. This was a report for an event, the number of attendees, who the audience was, etc. But they tied it back into the economic impact, right? So it's important whenever you go through an evaluation process, whenever you're gathering data, to use this data to start thinking about what is the impact we're having. So I wanted to highlight this. I know a number of you are already sharing reports like this to your city council, to your city managers in response to the contracts that you have, but it doesn't take that much effort to pull tidbits out of those reports to your local government partners and create a storytelling piece. The storytelling piece around how you're doing and the impact that you're having are critical to your board recruitment, they're critical to your fundraising efforts, they're critical to your grant writing success as well. So that's the quick sort of 20-minute overview of the evaluation piece. I did want to say we are available. I do have a number of tools and handouts. Kudos to a number of the board chairs who have reached out and said, hey, I'm looking for an evaluation or assessment on this particular topic. I was able to get them some products. So I think what I would say is you don't want to overdo the amount of time you spend on some of these. There's some very simple, quick, and easy tools you can accomplish. I will close by saying that all of our webinars are recorded, and if you go to youtube.com and search for the New Mexico Main Street channel, you'll come up with a list of all the webinars. This is the third webinar in this this second half of the current fiscal year that were really directed at boards, right? So the first one around powerful practices for boards. The second one that Amy presented a couple of months ago on board role and activities in fundraising, and this third one on evaluation. For those of you who will be seeing in our site visit cycle in September, October, and November, we're looking forward to that. We are working on some adjustments to our site visit process, and our questioning piece really be a little bit much more helpful in helping you move through the economic transformation strategies. So I'm going to close with that. I'll check in and see if anybody has any questions for us that we want to address. And if not, we'll wait a few minutes. We have a couple of thank yous coming in. Any other questions?
I was going to say, if ever we realize that sometimes these are kind of bite-sized chunks, these webinars, and sometimes you may be driving in your car, sitting at your desk later, something about the presentation today may resonate. Of course, I think you know that the communication channels are pretty open here with MainStreet, so if you had a question later for Eduardo on this presentation as you dig into the material, or me, I can refer those questions to Eduardo. Just, again, feel free to kind of reach out to us. And as Eduardo mentioned, probably by the end of today, this session will be up on the YouTube channel. So if you want to share it with other board members or other folks that you think might benefit from this presentation, please feel free to do so. And we really appreciate your taking time to join us during your lunch hour.
Thank you, Anna. Looks like we have one question, so we're just ready to get self-evaluations done. We already had a switch of board seats to make sure our board is engaged and active. So it's more of a comment. Doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and close the presentation and then Anna will send out the link to the webinar. If you do have board members who could not join us today and want to get some idea of what today's webinar was about, please make sure and share that link with them.
Thank y'all. Take care.